The morning of that fateful day in 1972 arrived like any other in Harlem, but those who truly knew the streets could sense something different in the air, a tension that crackled like static electricity before a storm. Frank Lucas stood at the window of his penthouse apartment on Riverside Drive, watching the city wake below him, a king surveying his kingdom. But even kings have enemies, and Frank's most dangerous adversary was preparing to make his move. Frank Lucas wasn't just another name in the catalog of New York's criminal underworld. He was a legend in the making, a man who had revolutionized the heroin trade by cutting out the middlemen and dealing directly with suppliers in Southeast Asia. His Blue Magic brand had flooded the streets of Harlem with a product so pure and so cheap that it had made him a millionaire many times over. He wore custom-made suits, drove luxury cars, and lived a life that most street hustlers could only dream about. Yet beneath the veneer of success, Frank understood a fundamental truth about power. It was never truly yours. You were merely borrowing it until someone stronger came along to take it away. That someone was known simply as Tango, a nickname that spoke to his unpredictable, dangerous dance through the criminal landscape. Where Frank had built his empire through strategic thinking and business acumen, Tango ruled through fear and brutality. He was a man who believed that respect came from the barrel of a gun, and his reputation for violence preceded him like the smell of cordite after a shooting. For months, the two had circled each other like predators, each waiting for the other to show weakness, each calculating the cost of a confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. The rivalry between Frank Lucas and Tango represented more than just a territorial dispute or a clash of egos. It symbolized two competing philosophies about how power should be wielded in the underworld. Frank saw himself as a businessman who happened to deal in illegal substances. He believed in organization, loyalty, and keeping a low profile. Tango, on the other hand, embraced chaos. He wanted everyone to know his name, to fear his wrath, to understand that he answered to no one. Their conflict had become the talk of every bar, every corner, every smoke-filled room where criminals gathered to gossip and scheme. What made this particular day so significant wasn't just the confrontation itself, but what it represented for the future of organized crime in New York. The old guard was watching carefully, understanding that whoever emerged victorious would shape the landscape of the drug trade for years to come. Corrupt cops had placed their bets, rival gangs had chosen their sides, and innocent people who lived in the crossfire zones had barricaded themselves indoors, hoping that when the storm passed, they would still be standing. As Frank finished his morning coffee and prepared to face whatever the day would bring, he knew that by sunset, the balance of power in Harlem would have shifted forever. One empire would rise and another would fall. The streets would remember this day, and the legend of what happened would be whispered about in hushed tones for generations to come. The weeks leading up to the confrontation had transformed Harlem into a pressure cooker ready to explode. Every corner, every alley, every smoke-filled pool hall buzzed with nervous energy as Frank Lucas's crew and Tango's soldiers eyed each other with barely concealed hostility. The unwritten rules that had governed the streets for years, the invisible boundaries that kept rival operations from colliding, had begun to crumble like old brick under relentless pressure. It started with small provocations. One of Frank's dealers found his stash house tagged with Tango's symbol, a crude drawing of two crossed machetes. A week later, two of Tango's runners were beaten bloody in an alley that everyone knew belonged to Frank's operation. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew. The streets always knew. These weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully orchestrated moves in a chess game where the stakes were measured in territory, money, and blood. The territorial disputes intensified with each passing day. 116th Street, once clearly divided between the two operations, had become a no-man's land where dealers from both sides refused to back down. The Lenox Avenue corridor, which generated thousands of dollars in daily revenue, saw 3 shootings in 2 weeks as both factions tried to assert dominance. Local business owners found themselves caught in the middle, paying protection money to both sides just to keep their windows intact and their doors open. But territory was just the visible manifestation of a deeper struggle for power and influence. Frank had built his empire on connections, with suppliers overseas, with corrupt police officers, with politicians who looked the other way for the right price. Tango, younger and hungrier, wanted those connections for himself. He'd been making moves, whispering in the right ears, suggesting that Frank was getting old, that his time had passed, that new leadership was needed. Some of Frank's own people had begun to waver, wondering if perhaps Tango's more aggressive approach was what the changing times demanded. The rumor mill worked overtime. In barbershops, old men spoke in hushed tones about an impending war. In after-hours clubs, women who knew both men whispered warnings to their friends to stay off certain streets at certain times. Even the police, usually content to let criminals kill each other, began to take notice. Detective Richie Roberts, one of the few honest cops in a sea of corruption, had been hearing the same intelligence from multiple informants. Something big was coming. Something that would make previous gang conflicts look like playground scuffles. The most telling sign came from the neutral parties, the numbers runners, the bookies, the independent operators who profited from maintaining good relationships with everyone. They began to choose sides, understanding that when the dust settled, neutrality would be seen as betrayal by whoever emerged victorious. Longtime partnerships dissolved overnight. Brothers stopped speaking to each other. The entire criminal ecosystem was reorganizing itself around the coming conflict. In the dive bars where criminals gathered after dark, the betting had begun. Not on whether there would be a confrontation, that was already accepted as inevitable, but on when it would happen, where it would happen, and who would walk away. Some put their money on Frank's experience and strategic brilliance. Others bet on Tango's ruthlessness and youth. But everyone agreed on one thing. When these two titans finally clashed, Harlem would never be the same. The location Frank Lucas chose for the confrontation spoke volumes about the kind of man he was, bold, calculating, and utterly unafraid. It wasn't some dark alley or abandoned warehouse where bodies could disappear without witnesses. No, Frank picked the corner of 116th Street and 8th Avenue at high noon on a Thursday, one of the busiest intersections in Harlem, where the pulse of everyday life beat strongest and loudest. The street corner was alive with the rhythm of urban existence. Mrs. Johnson stood outside her bodega, arranging displays of fresh produce while gossiping with her sister about the previous night's church meeting. 3 doors down, Jimmy's barbershop hummed with the buzz of clippers and the animated debates of men discussing everything from baseball to politics. Children in their Catholic school uniforms walked in small groups toward the subway, laughing and pushing each other playfully. Street vendors hawked their wares, watches, sunglasses, hot dogs, their voices creating a symphony of commerce that had defined this corner for generations. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete, creating shimmering heat waves that rose from the pavement like ghosts. Office workers on their lunch breaks hurried past, clutching paper bags from the deli, lost in their own thoughts about deadlines and bills and weekend plans. An elderly man fed pigeons near the fire hydrant, the same ritual he'd performed every day for 15 years. A young mother pushed a stroller while simultaneously trying to wrangle a toddler who wanted to investigate everything. This was Harlem at its most ordinary, its most innocent, its most alive. When Frank Lucas emerged from his black Cadillac, accompanied by his cousin and closest lieutenant, he moved with the casual confidence of a man who owned not just the corner, but the entire neighborhood. He wore an impeccably tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people on that corner made in a month. But it wasn't his expensive clothes that made people take notice. It was the aura of absolute certainty that surrounded him like an invisible force field. The presence of so many civilians wasn't an accident or an oversight in Frank's planning. It was the entire point. By choosing this moment, this place, Frank was making a statement that would echo through the criminal underworld for years to come. He was declaring that he didn't need the cover of darkness or the privacy of back rooms. He operated by his own rules, and if that meant conducting business where mothers shopped for groceries and children played hopscotch, then so be it. The audacity of the choice was breathtaking. Most criminals understood the unwritten code: keep civilians out of it. Conduct your business in the shadows where the straight world didn't have to see the machinery of the underworld at work. But Frank had always been different. He'd built his empire by breaking rules, by zigging when everyone else zagged, by doing what conventional wisdom said was impossible. Choosing this public arena was vintage Frank Lucas, a calculated risk that demonstrated not just his courage, but his understanding of power and perception. As Tango's car pulled up to the opposite corner, the ordinary citizens of Harlem had no idea they were about to witness history. They couldn't have known that this sunny Thursday afternoon would become the stuff of legend, retold in hushed whispers and exaggerated tales for decades. They were simply living their lives, unaware that they were extras in a drama that would define an era. The moment Tango stepped out of his vehicle, the atmosphere on 116th Street changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air that only the most street-smart residents could detect. The vendors became quieter. Conversations died mid-sentence. People who had lived in Harlem long enough to recognize danger when it walked among them suddenly found urgent reasons to be somewhere else. But most remained, frozen by curiosity or trapped by circumstance, about to witness something they would never forget. Tango cut an imposing figure as he stood on his corner of the intersection. Younger than Frank by nearly a decade, he wore his reputation for violence like a second skin. His leather jacket hung open despite the heat, and those who knew what to look for could see the bulge of a weapon at his waist. Two of his most trusted enforcers flanked him, their eyes scanning the crowd with the cold efficiency of predators assessing prey. Tango's face was set in an expression of contempt, his jaw clenched tight as he stared across the street at Frank Lucas. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other across the divide of concrete and yellow paint that separated their sides of the intersection. The space between them might have been only 40 feet, but it represented years of rivalry, countless slights both real and imagined, and fundamentally incompatible visions of how power should be wielded. The crowd sensed the electricity in the air, that terrible moment before lightning strikes, when every hair stands on end and the world seems to hold its breath. Then Frank Lucas began to walk. Not quickly, not with any sense of urgency or fear, but with the measured pace of a man who had already decided how this encounter would end. His cousin moved to follow, but Frank raised a hand, a simple gesture that said he would handle this alone. Each step he took across that intersection was a statement of dominance, a declaration that he feared nothing and no one. Tango watched him approach, his hand drifting toward his weapon, his muscles tensing like a coiled spring ready to release. They met in the middle of the crosswalk, in that liminal space where neither man could claim complete territorial control. Up close, the contrast between them became even more apparent. Frank, older and more refined, carried himself with the bearing of a corporate executive. Tango, all raw energy and barely contained rage, radiated the kind of street violence that made people cross to the other side of the road. When Frank spoke, his voice was low enough that the surrounding crowd couldn't hear the words, but everyone could see Tango's reaction, a flash of anger, then something that might have been fear. What happened next occurred so quickly that witnesses would later disagree on the exact sequence of events. Frank's hand moved inside his jacket. Tango reached for his own weapon. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the afternoon calm like a rock through glass. Pigeons exploded into flight. A woman screamed. Children hit the ground, trained by urban survival to recognize the sound of death. When the echo faded, Tango lay on the asphalt, blood pooling beneath him in a spreading crimson lake. Frank Lucas stood over him, his weapon still drawn, his expression unchanged. He didn't run, he didn't panic, he simply stood there, making eye contact with every person in the crowd, ensuring they understood what they had witnessed. This wasn't murder born of passion or desperation. This was an execution, calculated and deliberate, a message written in blood for anyone who thought about challenging his authority. Frank calmly returned his weapon to its holster, adjusted his jacket, and walked back to his Cadillac as if he'd just concluded a routine business meeting. The message was clear, unmistakable, and would echo through every criminal enterprise in New York. Frank Lucas answered challenges not with negotiation or compromise, but with absolute, final authority. For several seconds after the gunshot, 116th Street existed in a state of suspended animation. The world had paused, as if reality itself needed a moment to process what had just occurred. Then, like a dam breaking, the scene erupted into chaos. Mrs. Johnson dropped her bag of groceries, oranges rolling across the sidewalk like small planets escaping orbit. The young mother scooped up her children and ran, not looking back, her stroller abandoned on the corner. Men who moments earlier had been debating sports statistics now pressed themselves against storefronts, their faces drained of color, their hands shaking. Jimmy rushed out of his barber shop, half a haircut abandoned, his customer still caped and sitting in the chair, both of them staring at the body lying in the intersection. The old man who'd been feeding pigeons stood frozen, breadcrumbs still clutched in his trembling hand, his mind struggling to reconcile the violence he'd just witnessed with the peaceful ritual he'd been performing. A teenager who'd seen it all pulled out his beeper, fingers fumbling with the buttons, desperate to spread the news to friends who wouldn't believe it until they heard it from multiple sources. Within minutes, the story began to spread through Harlem like wildfire, jumping from rooftop to rooftop. The payphones on every corner rang constantly as witnesses called anyone who would listen. In pool halls and after-hours clubs, conversations stopped dead as breathless messengers burst through doors with the news. Frank killed Tango, in broad daylight, in front of everybody, on 116th Street. Each retelling added new details, some true, some embellished, but the core remained the same. Frank Lucas had just done the unthinkable. The criminal underworld received the news with a mixture of shock and grim understanding. In a smoke-filled back room on 125th Street, 3 of Tango's top lieutenants sat in stunned silence, realizing that their positions of power had just evaporated with their boss's last breath. They looked at each other with the recognition that they now faced a choice: pledge loyalty to Frank Lucas or leave town before sunset. 2 blocks away, Frank's own crew celebrated with expensive champagne, their relief palpable. They'd backed the right horse, and now the entire territory would be theirs. Rival gang leaders throughout the 5 boroughs received phone calls from their intelligence networks. In Brooklyn, a man known as Big Mike listened to the report and immediately canceled his plans to expand into Harlem. In the Bronx, a crew that had been considering challenging Frank's supply routes decided that perhaps other opportunities would be wiser to pursue. The calculus of criminal ambition had suddenly changed. Frank Lucas hadn't just killed a rival, he'd redefined what it meant to have power in New York's underworld. By nightfall, Frank's reputation had transformed from respected to legendary. The stories circulating through the streets painted him as something more than human, a figure who operated by rules known only to himself, who could orchestrate death in broad daylight and walk away without consequence. Young hustlers who'd never met him spoke his name with reverence. Older criminals who'd seen empires rise and fall admitted they'd never witnessed anything quite like it. Even corrupt cops on Frank's payroll found themselves slightly unnerved by the brazenness of the act, wondering what other lines this man might be willing to cross. The incident on 116th Street became a dividing line in the history of organized crime in New York. There was before, when multiple players jockeyed for position and power seemed negotiable, and there was after, when everyone understood that Frank Lucas had established himself as untouchable, a king who ruled not through consensus or tradition, but through the sheer force of will and the willingness to do what others only threatened. The streets belonged to him now, completely and absolutely, and every criminal in the city knew it. In the weeks following the shooting, fear became the invisible currency that purchased Frank Lucas more power than money ever could. Small-time dealers who'd once operated with relative independence now sought his permission before making moves. Crews that had maintained neutral positions suddenly pledged allegiance, understanding that neutrality was no longer an option in a world where Frank had demonstrated he would eliminate obstacles without hesitation. The swagger that young criminals typically displayed evaporated in his presence, replaced by a careful deference that bordered on reverence. Tango's former organization collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm, his lieutenants scattered to different boroughs, some leaving the drug trade entirely, others attempting to reinvent themselves under new management. The territory he'd controlled, lucrative blocks that generated thousands in daily revenue, fell into Frank's hands without a single additional shot being fired. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. One act of violence had accomplished what months of traditional gang conflict might have required. Dealers who'd once split their loyalty now had clarity about who truly ruled Harlem. The power vacuum created opportunities that Frank exploited with surgical precision. He restructured supply lines, consolidated distribution networks, and installed his own trusted people in key positions throughout the expanded territory. His Blue Magic brand flooded streets that had previously been closed to him. Profit margins increased exponentially. Within a month, Frank's operation had grown by nearly 40%, and he'd accomplished it with an efficiency that impressed even his harshest critics. The criminal underworld operated on Darwinian principles, and Frank had just proven himself the apex predator. But success at this level never comes without complications. The brazenness of the 116th Street shooting had broken an unwritten rule that even the most violent criminals typically respected: keep the straight world out of it. By executing Tango in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses, Frank had forced the authorities' hand. They could no longer pretend not to see what was happening in Harlem. The pressure from community leaders, religious organizations, and concerned citizens became impossible to ignore. Detective Richie Roberts, who'd been tracking Frank's operation with the obsessive focus of a man who believed in justice even when his colleagues didn't, suddenly found his department willing to allocate resources to his investigation. Federal agencies that had previously shown little interest in Harlem's drug trade now attended interdepartmental meetings. The shooting had made headlines, and headlines meant political pressure, which meant that Frank Lucas was no longer just another criminal. He was a problem that needed solving. Frank noticed the increased surveillance almost immediately. Unmarked cars appeared on his block. His phones developed the telltale clicks and delays that suggested wiretaps. Associates reported being followed, questioned, pressured to cooperate. The protection he'd purchased through corrupt cops suddenly seemed less reliable, as honest officers, emboldened by public outcry, began investigating with renewed vigor. Frank had won the battle for criminal supremacy, but in doing so, he'd painted a target on his back that even his considerable resources might not be able to remove. The irony wasn't lost on Frank as he sat in his penthouse one evening, watching the city lights twinkle below. He'd achieved everything he'd set out to accomplish: total dominance of the Harlem drug trade, wealth beyond imagination, a reputation that would outlive him. But the very act that had secured his position had also set in motion the forces that would eventually bring him down. Power, he was learning, came with a price that couldn't be calculated until the bill arrived. And for Frank Lucas, that bill was being prepared by men in federal buildings who had resources, patience, and the law on their side. Years later, when people spoke about Frank Lucas, and they always spoke about Frank Lucas, the conversation inevitably circled back to that Thursday afternoon on 116th Street. The shooting became the defining moment of his criminal career, the incident that transformed him from successful drug dealer into legend. It was his Rubicon, the point of no return that separated his story into before and after. Everything he accomplished afterward existed in the shadow of those few violent seconds when he proved himself willing to do what others only threatened. The brilliance of Frank's strategy, viewed through the cold lens of criminal pragmatism, was undeniable. He'd understood something fundamental about power that many of his contemporaries missed. Perception often matters more than reality. By killing Tango in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, Frank had created a myth about himself that was worth more than any amount of muscle or firepower he could have accumulated. He demonstrated that he operated beyond the normal constraints of fear and consequences that governed ordinary criminals. In doing so, he'd weaponized his own audacity. The public nature of the violence wasn't a flaw in his plan, it was the plan. Frank knew that a body discovered in an abandoned building might generate whispers and speculation, but a public execution witnessed by dozens of ordinary citizens going about their daily lives would generate something far more valuable: certainty. There would be no room for doubt, no space for rival gangsters to dismiss it as rumor or exaggeration. Everyone would know exactly what Frank Lucas was capable of, and more importantly, they would know he was capable of it anywhere, anytime, regardless of who was watching. Yet this same boldness that elevated him also contained the seeds of his eventual downfall. The shooting forced authorities to act, brought federal attention to his operation, and ultimately contributed to the investigation that would dismantle his empire. In his quest for absolute dominance within the criminal world, he'd failed to adequately consider the response from the legitimate world. He'd won the battle, but set himself up to lose the war. It was a miscalculation born of hubris, the belief that his power extended beyond the streets and into realms where different rules applied. The lasting impact of that day extended far beyond Frank's personal story. The incident became a case study in criminal psychology, discussed in law enforcement academies and criminology courses. It represented a turning point in how organized crime operated in New York, marking the transition from old-school mobster discretion to a more brazen, attention-seeking approach that would characterize the drug wars of the 1970s and 1980s. Frank hadn't just changed his own trajectory, he'd influenced the evolution of urban crime itself. For the witnesses who stood on that corner, the memory never faded. Decades later, some would still cross the street rather than walk past the spot where Tango fell. Mrs. Johnson eventually moved to Queens, unable to look at that corner without seeing blood on the pavement. The children who'd hit the ground at the sound of gunfire grew up with an understanding of street violence that shaped their choices and their futures. Frank Lucas had wanted to send a message, and he'd succeeded, but the message echoed far beyond his intended audience, touching innocent lives in ways he'd never considered and probably never cared about. In the end, the shooting on 116th Street stands as a perfect encapsulation of Frank Lucas himself. Brilliant and reckless, strategic and impulsive, powerful and ultimately self-destructive. It was the moment when he seized everything he wanted and simultaneously set in motion everything he would lose.